Today is January the 28th, 2013, and I'm Nancy Ungerman. I'll be interviewing Elia Naxon, and our videographer is Ruth Andrus. Go!
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm Elia Naxon. I've been in Dallas since 1952, which is 3/4 of my life. I'm 85 years old this year. I was born in New York, in the Bronx, New York in 1927, and my parents were Rabbi Saul Hurwitz, and he was an Orthodox rabbi, and Shoshana Cantor, who was my mother and was born in Israel. Her families were some of the earliest immigrants to the Yishuv in the 1880s. I have 3 younger brothers, and I'm very proud of their accomplishments. My oldest brother, Marshall, is a Reform rabbi, and he's also a professor of classics, that's Greek and Latin. And my second brother is Ariel, and he lives on a kibbutz in Israel. He made Aliyah in 1951 and fought for the Israeli army. He has a PhD in history from the Hebrew University, and he is the editor of the oldest Holocaust journal in the world. And my youngest brother, Rafi, studied hydraulic engineering in Holland because, of course, they have waterways, and he helped design the port in Ashdod. So we have a lot of connections with Israel and with Jewish life. My home was very Jewish and very Zionist because of this background. In fact, my parents spoke to us in Hebrew rather than Yiddish. That was not a language I learned when I was a child. And we also had a very cultural life. My mother gave me books to read way ahead of my years, and I was very fortunate because both of my parents were very literate. I was interested in the arts. I studied dancing. In fact, I studied with a dance group that performed at Carnegie Hall. So I always say, I danced at Carnegie Hall, but it was just one time. As a teenager, I joined one of the Zionist youth groups. It was called Hashomer Hatzair, and that defined my teen years. I was a very strong Zionist, so that when I was in college, during the Israeli War for Independence, the summer of 1948, I was secretary to the editor of Haboker, which was an Israeli newspaper, and I also worked for the Haganah clandestinely. I actually smuggled gold from Mexico to New York, and then it was transshipped to Switzerland in order to pay for the armaments. In fact, my boyfriend at the time enlisted in the Israeli army, or I guess you would call that. He was working for the Haganah. He had flown as a pilot during World War II, so he was able to fly from Czechoslovakia and fly the arms to Israel. And these were very important. All of my friends, my close friends, were involved.
I'm not good at the math. How old were you?
At the time I was 19, I was in college. But it was very important to my life. I didn't think about the dangers involved. Later I thought I could have been arrested. I mean, international smuggling is not exactly something you do, but it was so important to us because of the way we were raised that I felt that I had to do it. And I was planning to go to Israel. In fact, I went to college in Florida at the University of Miami in the field of subtropical botany because I was going to be a chalutz and live in Israel and build the new state, and it was very exciting. However, that same year I met Bill Naxon, and he changed my mind.
Where did you meet him?
I met him in Florida. And actually, his roommate was a member of ISFA, which was a Zionist youth group on campus. And so through the Zionist youth group, I met my husband, which was very important. We did have a lot in common in that we both came from huge families and loved the idea of huge families. Bill was born into a family of 8 older sisters. and he was very comfortable with women. In fact, the third week that I was going with him occasionally, he invited me out for my birthday, which was wonderful, and he gave me an album of Scheherazade by Stravinsky. And I said, oh, this guy gets me. And he did. I mean, he was just wonderful. He found something that I really loved and got to know me very quickly. Anyway, we were married in 1949, and at the time we moved, his family had a chain of small department stores and 5 and 10 cent stores in towns in North Carolina and Virginia. And so our first home was in Wytheville, Virginia. Wytheville being a town of 7,500, it was a culture shock for me. But it was interesting. And then we moved to a slightly larger town called Gastonia. There were 40,000 people there. And finally to Charlotte. But Bill was very restless. He was the youngest of 8 sisters, as I said, and his, yes?
Tell the story about him being
Born.
born.
Oh, Bill's birth was very interesting. He had 8 older sisters, and the family was living in a small town called Kinston, North Carolina. His father was away on a buying trip to Baltimore, and in Baltimore he bought for his little dry goods store, and he came home by train because we weren't flying in those days. This was in 1923. He came home by train, and it was in the evening, and he was met by everybody in town with torches, and they yelled, Eli, Eli, you have a son. And they put him on their shoulder, and they took him home. The whole town was very excited about this. And he came in, and Bill's mother said, Eli, you have a son. And she opened.
A daughter.
No, a son.
Oh, a son.
Yeah, she have a son. And then she opened the blanket, and he looked, he says, yes, it is a son. And that was Bill. I always said Bill came into the world very much loved, and he went out of this world last summer in June of 2012, very much loved, surrounded by a family of his own, that he had 4 children and 7 grandchildren, and a marriage of 63 years. So he was a lucky man, and I was lucky to have found him then. After we had lived in Charlotte for a while, Bill was very restless. As I said, he was the youngest in the family, and his brother-in-laws, who loved him dearly, treated him like kid brother. He never felt that he got the responsibility or the respect that he wanted. So he said, I'm going to strike out on my own. And he sold his interest in the business and found a franchise here in Dallas, Texas. It was Rayco Seat Covers, and we came to Dallas sight unseen. I mean, when you're young, you do things like that. And I loved coming to Dallas in 1952 because it was larger than 40,000 people. It had probably at the time about close to 500,000, maybe 400,000. And there was a wonderful Jewish community, and immediately I felt very comfortable here. It was a close Jewish community, which surprised me. Everybody seemed to be involved, and within 2 years I thought I knew everybody. Of course I didn't know everybody in the Jewish community, but it felt that way. And we got involved with Hadassah and B'nai B'rith and the Council of Jewish Women. Initially we were members of Temple Shereth Israel because it was conservative, and I could not ask my father to come to a Reform congregation, although he was liberal, but not that liberal. And so we stayed at Shereth Israel until my father passed away, and then we moved to Temple, which was in the 60s. Mm-hmm. But it almost didn't matter where you were, because we crossed lines. Our friendships crossed lines. It didn't matter whether someone was extremely Orthodox or extremely Reform. If we had the common Jewish values, that's the way it was. One of the interesting things about living in Dallas was, for instance, we went every summer for about 25 or 30 years to the B'nai B'rith Institutes. And I would say that most of the friendships and close friendships that we had were people who joined us at these institutes. It was every summer for long weekends. We brought in outstanding speakers in the field of Judaism. It could be a history, it could be a rabbi, it could be somebody with other kinds of interests. They could be a sociologist. But we learned a lot about Jewish life in our own community and also outside of the community. So those were profound things. And there were probably between 50 and 100 people who attended every year. So we had a large circle of friends with common interests. Ruth, you were there. And that was also very formative in our early years in Dallas. And Dallas was that kind of community. It was growing and forming and becoming more of a large community. And I always thought that this was probably the jewel of Jewish communities in this country. When I visited other communities, I never felt that same closeness. Now things have changed. We're so big now. We have 60,000 or 65,000. But at the time there was 25,000, and it was just wonderful. Here in Dallas, we were in business, and eventually we opened another aspect of our business called Braco with our very closest friends, Rose and Saul Saginaw, and we remained friends and business partners to the end. Our families we celebrated holidays and all the simchas together. We raised a family of 4. They all live in Dallas. I have 2 daughters and 2 sons, Jan, Elise, Adam, and Seth. And between them, they have provided me with 7 marvelous grandchildren. And they all live here in Dallas, so we're very fortunate. We have all of our holidays together. I've spoken about the B'nai B'rith Institutes. I think maybe I would like to talk about my own personal opportunities in this community. In the early 80s, Bill sold his business, and he went into real estate, and I was kind of at loose ends because I had been working with him. And I decided that I had had a lifelong urge to become an occupational therapist. I tried to talk my daughter into it. She wouldn't do it. So I finally decided, well, maybe I should do it. I was 45, and I thought no one would hire me, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I did enroll in a master's program in occupational therapy and had a wonderful career. First, I worked for the Visiting Nurse Association, and I ran a program for them for several years. And then I was hired on a grant by Texas Women's University for 7 years. I worked at the Veterans Hospital. Again, it was a wonderful community experience. It was a wonderful professional experience. But I loved working outside of the Jewish community because I never had done this before. And I learned about people in Texas. I learned about a variety of cultures that I had never been exposed to. I mean, only in a simple way, but now I really learned about how people respond in life. It was a great experience, and I think it broadened me. And it gave me another interesting opportunity. In the early 1980s, Israel was quietly bringing Yemenite Jews to Israel. They called it Operation Moses, and they would bring in a airplane and in the middle of the night in the desert, and they would bring the whole group of Ethiopians to Israel. Unfortunately, in 1985, somebody blew the whistle, and they couldn't do it anymore, and the Israeli embassy was kicked out of Ethiopia because of that. They were in the midst of a civil war, and it became a political football, so to speak. So we had nobody on the ground. The Israeli government no longer knew what was going on with the Jews. And so through the Religious Action Committee of the Reform Movement, I was recruited to go as a therapist to train nurses in rehabilitation in Gondar Hospital. Gondar is the area in Ethiopia where most of the Jews were concentrated. So being in the hospital, I could keep my ear to the ground of what was going on. It was really 2 months of a very interesting experience. There was a doctor with me also from Jewish doctor. Neither one of us identified ourselves as Jews. When somebody asked me what my religion was, I said, I'm a Reconstructionist. Mm-hmm. They didn't know what it was, and they accepted it for whatever I said. But, and besides, I was in my 50s at the time. I couldn't possibly be a spy, except I was, because I had to report both to the Israeli government through people who traveled through the country, and I also had to report to the charge d'affaires of the American embassy in Addis Ababa, because there was a civil war going on. And the hospital that I was involved with also had soldiers who'd been killed, not killed, wounded in the Civil War. So I knew when there was a big battle, we'd have an influx of soldiers who had been shot or serious, very serious wounds, which I worked with them too, as well as I could. They had a limitation on their medical equipment. So I made a lot of medical equipment. I taught the nurses how to do rehab. They had no concept of rehabilitation. It was a very good personal experience, and I felt that I was doing something also for my Jewish people. Although when I went there, I had some reservations, I must tell you. I said, these people who say they're Jewish have not been trained the way I was. They're not biblical, and they're not rabbinic Judaism. They don't know rabbinic Judaism, since they lived biblical Judaism, and they celebrated their holidays only as they celebrated them in the Bible. They had no concept of the Talmud or anything that developed in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries after. So it was a very good experience just meeting them, and they're wonderful people. They're very bright, and I came away saying, look, if they say they're Jewish, I'm with them. Anybody who says they're Jewish, I'm with them. But my reservations were early. I really wondered how I would feel about working with that group. So that was also a very great personal experience, that because of my profession and because of being so involved in Jewish life, I had this opportunity to serve. What else can I tell you? Well, I can say this, I'd like to talk about my marriage a little bit in terms of how we lived in this community. Bill was active in B'nai B'rith. We were active in the JCC. Our kids went to all the JCC events. We built a house 5 blocks away from the Jewish Community Center. There were a lot of people, and this became a Jewish neighborhood because of the Jewish Community Center. And we just loved it. The high school that my children went to was probably 40% Jewish at the time.
Which high school?
Hillcrest High School. Hillcrest High School. And their friends were Jewish and some non-Jewish. I mean, they participated in all kinds of activities. But for as small a Jewish community, I felt that we had a lot of opportunities both to live in a Jewish community and a secular community, which was very, very satisfying. In fact, Bill came from a very small town, and he had no opportunity to live a really true Jewish life. And I came from a very large city, which in its own way, while there were many Jews living in New York City, had so many distractions that you didn't live an intensely Jewish life. My father being a rabbi, we had a congregation, and we had people that we related to, but there were so many distractions. You have your cultural life, you have music, you have theater, you have dance, you have all kinds of secular things that are going on in a large community that are not necessarily Jewish. And in fact, one time I was talking to a rabbi that I'm very close to, Schulweiss, and I said to him, I enjoy those secular things like music and dance and things like that. And he said, that's fine, just Judaize it. And I thought that was a good instinct. So I stayed in the Jewish community. I still do programming. I'm part of the Dallas Jewish Historical Society board. I have been doing programming for 12 years at least. I think it's 12 years, it may even be more. And I feel a very fulfilled life. I think for anybody living in Dallas, in the Jewish community, in this golden period, from the end of World War II until this day, that we have the advantages of a very good life. Most of the Jewish community has done fairly well. We made a good living. and we were able to send our kids to good schools. But more than that, there's not a lot of separation. People are not valued here based on money. It's what they do on the community, how they participate. You can live in the Jewish community and the non-Jewish community. In the non-Jewish community, I find a lot of not only support, but really I've represented them something good. And so Dallas is a wonderful place. I hope it continues like this. If we ever get too large, maybe it won't. But this is the way I feel about living here. And I'm finished. Okay.
Okay. Your father was an Orthodox rabbi?
Yes, my father was an Orthodox rabbi, but he was a modern Orthodox rabbi. He graduated from American universities, and although he was born in Europe, but he came here as a young teenager, and he was an intellectual as well, and he wrote a lot. He wrote music, he wrote plays. He was also, besides his Jew, and he had fellow rabbis in various denominations. I mean, he just liked the challenge of it. He was quite an intellectual. My mother was also very bright. She spoke 7 languages. I can't believe anybody knows 7 languages. But she was born in Israel, and of course she came from a family that moved from Kiev, from Russia, but their language at home was French, because the educated family spoke French. So she spoke French, she spoke Hebrew. She studied during World War I. She was with her sister in Egypt, and she was still a teenager, so they put her in an Italian convent to finish high school. So she spoke Italian, and she spoke Yiddish, and she spoke German, and she spoke English. And well, I guess that's 7 or whatever. We figured 7. So we had a very interesting family. I mean, I learned to sing French nursery songs as well as Hebrew nursery songs when I was a child. And my brother became a linguist. He taught Greek and that. I think I was extremely fortunate to have a very good, exciting growing up. My grandparents lived not too far from us, and they had a private home in New York that was very unusual. They had their own private home, and we had all of our seders for as long as we could at my grandfather's and grandmother's house. In fact, one of the funny stories I remember is my grandmother had these 2 big rooms on the main floor, and with pocket doors that they had in those days. She opened the pocket doors in the dining room table. Everybody crowded around the dining room table, except the little ones when I was little. She set up a table for us with an ironing board. She made the ironing board low and put a tablecloth on it, and 4 or 5 of us would sit on the table around the ironing board because there were too many of us. I have 20 first cousins. And even today, and I'm 85, of the 20, and I'm talking about husbands or wives, I'm just talking about the 20 cousins, only 4 have died. And so we have cousins in their 80s and 90s that are still living. We have good genes. They were a happy family, and they were very close. So my cousins are like my brothers and sisters. That was wonderful, too. And that's what I looked for when I got married, and Bill and I had both huge families. That is our greatest pleasure. That is our greatest pleasure. And, as I said, so Bill worked also in the community when he could, although his business was open 7 days a week, so he worked very hard at that. And he joined the Masons, and he did things in other areas of the community. And when I had vacation from work, which was in the summer since I was in academics, we often took trips abroad, so we hit every continent except South America. I never wanted to go to South America. I don't know why. I still don't. But we've done a lot of traveling. We've been to Israel 15 or 20 times at least. I go there every 2 or 3 years to visit my brother, or he comes here. And he has an extended family there. So traveling has been fun. The main thing that I feel is that we are so fortunate to have found Dallas and the Dallas Jewish community, because I think it reflects a lot of how we feel about life, some of the ethics. We've been able to surround ourselves with people who think like we do and live similar to the way we do. So
Yeah,
we're very lucky.
that you are surrounded by people like you. Just out of curiosity, how did you meet the Saginaws, which was your partner?
My part. Well, actually,
Very much like you.
yeah. I don't remember whether it was a Shereth Israel Sisterhood meeting, I think it was, or it could have been a Hadassah meeting. I mean, these get vague on. But Rose came in that day. She's a very powerful person. Comes into a room, she absolutely controlled it. And so all of us were very interested in this new person, and we became friendly, and I don't take anything for granted. I invited her to come over to the house, and we became friends. And they were looking for a business, and we helped get them into the RACO, and then together we formed the BRACO. So we spent many years together as friends, as business partners, with all the agreements and disagreements that happen in business. It didn't matter. It was like a family. We just got along. It was wonderful. And I miss them. And we even have our own by the way, we even have our own cemetery. And years ago, a friend of ours, Ruth Jacobson, decided that she needed to buy a triangle in the Hillcrest Sparkman Hillcrest. So she bought the property and sold it to those of us who were her closest friends. There are 50 graves in there, and all of my closest friends have married. Yeah, Rose and Sala are there, the Saginaws are there, the Bakers are there, the Weinbergers are there, the Dubins are there. These are all people that we have been friends with over the years, and it's wonderful. We have 50 graves of our family.
What
our extended family. What could be better?
This is going to be a hard question for you.
Okay.
Who of all these people would be your role models?
Okay. Well, on a personal level, I think Rose was my role model because she always challenged me. And when you have someone who challenges you, you get a little bit better, don't you? So, yes, she was my role model. But in terms of other people that Rabbi Schulweis, who came to some of our B'nai B'rith Institutes, was absolutely a role model for me in terms of my religious growth. He is a Reconstructionist rabbi, and he's still alive, thank goodness. And in fact, he had a son named Seth, so I had to have a son named Seth. But he taught me a lot about the flexibility of Judaism, as well as when I said to him, I don't believe in the efficacy of prayer, he said to me, prayer is poetry believed in. And suddenly it didn't matter, because when I say something in a prayer, I think of it as poetry. I think of it as my yearning, my soul's yearning, rather than something rote that I have to read. Things like that opened my eyes a lot to being part of the Jewish religion and Jewish. Yeah, so he was one of mine. And also, early on in our marriage, we went to another institute, Bill and I did actually, in North Carolina. It was one of the first that they had, and Mordechai Kaplan was there, and he was the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism. And so I would say that I have been a Reconstructionist since 1949, and I still believe in the basic philosophical view of Judaism that Reconstructionism provides. He was the one who developed the idea of chavuras, for instance, that things should be personal, extended families, because we move around a lot. And that's just one of the things, of course. He was just a brilliant man, and he was a very powerful influence in my life. And Rabbi Olin was, too. I loved his lectures. I felt like he never spoke down to me. He always challenged my thinking, and that was wonderful. So, I think there have been people like that along the way.
And just another question, you come from an Orthodox background. What made you gravitate first to conservative and then to reform?
Okay, well, I remember telling my father when I was 17, just before I started college, Dad, I think I'm an atheist. And he looked at me and he said, when I was 17, I was an atheist. He said, you find your way in life and you'll find what you need. And I did.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have to fight him anymore at that point. He was wonderful. He was very smart that way. Because if he said, what do you mean you're an atheist?
Uh-huh.
I would have been.
Good for him. Yeah.
Yeah, so, it's... Oh, how I made the journey. Well, of course, when I belonged to the Zionist youth group, we were all secular, culturally Jewish, not particularly religiously Jewish. Although we sang lots of songs that had its origins in the Bible. We would take phrases from the Bible and make songs out of it. So really, we weren't very far from religion, but we were far from organized religion. And that was part of the transition. And of course, in my undergraduate work, I was in the sciences, so a lot of the things that many Orthodox take for granted, I questioned. It was just a question of my own maturing into the way I think today, which is living in a religious community is important in terms of setting your values. God is not somebody, something or somebody that I visualize sitting on high. Rather, I read something one time and I think it's beautiful. It's like a synergy. Your hand is a synergy. Your hand is composed of individual fingers that each one of them can do one thing, but together they can do so much more. And God to me is a synergy. The universe and God is a combination of all that happens scientifically and all that happens spiritually. And it's more than, but you can't describe it. That's my synergy. God is my synergy. But, that everybody has their own personal way of looking at it, and it helps me get through my religious. I don't have conflict with any of the religious things because I've worked out my way of accepting a lot of the rituals, which if it was a pure ritual, I could not accept it. If it's a ritual that stands for something that I believe in, then I can accept it. And I just made those kind of compromises. That's why I'm not Orthodox anymore, but I certainly respect the Orthodox.
And how would your father feel as a Reformed
Well, my
Catholic?
brother became a Reform rabbi. And when he went to the Hebrew Union College, my father saw it as an education. Because all of my brothers, by the way, were educated in Orthodox yeshivas in the lower grades. I was the only one that wasn't because they didn't have girls going to a yeshiva. So the only Hebrew that I learned was at my mother's. When I was a child, I spoke some, and then I learned some from my mother, but my Hebrew is not as good as my brother's by any means. And, my brother became a Reform rabbi. He got his doctorate of, what do they call it, Doctor of Philosophy or whatever they call a religion. When you get your, from the Hebrew Union, you get some kind of a doctorate. Anyway, so he always introduced my son, the doctor. He didn't say my son, the rabbi. But other than that, he accepted him. He was very contemporary. We always had very exciting discussions around the dinner table. I mean, it was never quiet. And it kind of continues to this day because when we sit down with my kids, we always have very exciting, loud discussions.
Well, you're a wealth of information. It's a pleasure interviewing you. Is there anything you want to conclude?
Oh, let me look at my notes, see if there's something I missed.
You covered an awful lot.
Yeah, I've covered a lot, and I mean, I didn't talk about Bill because that's his story, other than our lives together here. And if I say anything, it's because the two of us lived that life.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
he had an interesting background too.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.